The city's underbelly remembered everything, even when people wanted to forget. Berlin never truly buried its ghosts. They clung to the brickwork, to the soot-streaked walls of forgotten factories, to the tangled underpasses where old rails rusted in the dark. And in early spring of 2025, when a pair of construction workers pried open the sealed cellar beneath an abandoned printing house in Mitte, those ghosts stirred again. What they found should not have existed. What they found should have been dust, long dissolved into the soil. Instead, it was waiting, packed, primed, preserved, as if the man who placed it there had stepped out only moments earlier. Inside a wooden crate, reinforced with steel straps corroded to a deep reddish brown, lay a set of explosives dated February 1945, Soviet-manufactured, cold to the touch, each piece wrapped in waxed cloth that had somehow resisted the decades. Beneath them, a small field journal with brittle pages, the handwriting sharp and deliberate, its ink only slightly faded, and beside it all, a metal badge bearing the insignia of a man officially recorded as missing in action during the final months of the Second World War. A saboteur deployed behind German lines. A ghost whose mission remained classified. A ghost whose disappearance had raised quiet questions within Soviet ranks. Questions that were never answered. The workers reported the crate. The police sealed the site. Forensics teams in white suits moved slowly across the cellar like drifting phantoms, and in the flickering yellow glow of portable lamps, the story of the saboteur began to surface, pulled fragment by fragment from the dust. The initial assumption was routine. Wartime remnants, nothing more. Another relic emerging from the endless labyrinth of Berlin's forgotten tunnels. But this time, something was different. These explosives were not hidden haphazardly. They were arranged with intent. They were untouched by detonation or decay. They were not abandoned. They were prepared. Investigators traced the badge number. They expected a dead end. Instead, it opened a file buried deep within what remained of Soviet wartime intelligence archives, cross-referenced with survivor testimonies from secret operations on the Eastern Front. The man identified was Alexei Mikhailovich Severin, a radio operator and demolition expert trained for covert urban sabotage. Records showed he crossed into Berlin in late January 1945 as part of a sleeper team meant to cripple German communication hubs from the inside during the Red Army advance. He was last heard from 6 days after infiltration. After that, silence. No extraction, no body, no trace. Only a mission left incomplete. Yet here, in this cellar, far from where he was last triangulated, was the cache he had prepared, as if he had known he would never return to finish what he began. Outside, the city kept moving. Tourists drifted through Alexanderplatz. Trams screeched along rails polished by countless journeys. But deep beneath the streets, investigators uncovered the subtle architecture of a life lived in shadows. They found signs of a small hideout carved behind the crumbling stone. A cot frame, half collapsed. A rusted mess tin, a torn Soviet field coat, stiff with age. It was all there, preserved in the cold, damp dark, untouched by human hands for 8 decades. The air smelled of earth, metallic and old, as if holding its breath. Halfway through the excavation, a question lingered like an echo, carried through time. And I want to ask you, too, as we descend further into this forgotten darkness, where are you watching this from right now? Because this story stretches across continents, across generations, across the fragile tether between past and present. and as we move deeper, it becomes more than a historical oddity. It becomes a puzzle carved into the spine of a dying city in its final hour of war. A puzzle left behind by a man whose existence was erased before his mission ever began. Severin's training dossier was sparse, but chilling. He was recruited from a remote signals battalion after being noticed for his unwavering composure under pressure. He had no surviving immediate family, no attachments, no loyalties except to the operation. He was fluent in German, a skill rare among rural recruits, and he possessed an unusual ability, a near photographic memory refined during code work. He could observe a street once and draw it perfectly hours later. He could commit building layouts to mind after a single hurried glimpse. His instructors described him as quiet, almost unnervingly so, with a gaze that seemed to drift beyond the present moment, as if he were already rehearsing scenarios that had not yet come to pass. His team infiltrated Berlin days before the city's collapse became inevitable. German control was fragmenting, but the Gestapo's hunt for spies grew increasingly vicious. Civilians whispered of disappearances in the dead of night, of men dragged into basements, of bodies left in alleys as warnings. The air was thick with paranoia, and Severin had been dropped into its core. His objective was simple but suicidal: plant charges near key communication points to disrupt German command during the Soviet final push. He carried enough explosives to cripple a district if placed correctly. But what investigators could not understand was this: none of the explosives found in the crate were missing. None had been used. Severin had not executed a single part of his assignment. It was as though, upon entering the city, his mission shifted. Something intercepted him. Something diverted him here, to this cellar, far from his expected route. Evidence suggested he spent several days inside the hideout. He cooked. He slept. He wrote brief notes in his journal, most of them indecipherable fragments. A handful were legible, mentions of patrols moving oddly, of coded broadcasts he intercepted but could not trace, of whispers in the corridors above. And then abruptly, his writing stopped. Not a single sign indicated where he went afterward. No signs of struggle, no tracks, no disturbance of the dust, except the layers that settled soft and undisturbed across decades. Some investigators proposed he fled further underground, deeper into the network of tunnels. Others argued he was found and executed, his body disposed of in the chaotic final weeks before Berlin fell. But neither theory sat well with the evidence. If the Germans had found him, why leave his explosives? Why leave his journal? Why leave everything arranged so meticulously, almost ritualistically, as if Severin himself knew he would not return and chose to preserve his legacy in one final act of defiance or desperation? And why, after all these decades, did the cellar remain sealed? The entrance was bricked over professionally, not hastily, not crudely. It was reinforced from the outside, as though someone wanted to ensure that whatever, or whoever, was inside remained untouched. Among the pages of Severin's journal was a list of coordinates. They appeared random at first glance, but analysts quickly realized they mapped out specific locations across Berlin, some of which no longer existed, others now bustling squares. Historians attempted to match the points with 1945 strategic targets, but the alignment was incomplete. Some spots were insignificant militarily. Some were residential buildings. One was a church basement. Another was the exact location of the very cellar where the crate was discovered. It was as if Severin was tracing something, or someone. No matter how the pieces were arranged, the narrative refused to settle. Severin should have been a footnote in a forgotten file. Instead, he became a question deep enough to span 80 years. As officers carried the crate up the narrow steps into the cold light of morning, the neighborhood gathered behind barricades. Some whispered it might be unexploded ordnance. Others speculated about secret tunnels beneath the city. A few elderly residents claimed they remembered rumors from their childhood. Stories of a phantom saboteur hunted by both sides, a man who appeared in windows then vanished into walls, a man who was neither German nor Soviet by the end, but something else entirely. It was only the beginning, because the deeper investigators dug, the stranger the fragments became. Some objects in the cellar seemed out of place for 1945. A scrap of cloth that forensic tests dated to the late 1950s, a button from a uniform not issued until 1963, a set of footprints preserved in dried mud, one overlapping another with decades of difference. Time inside that cellar felt layered, as though more than one person had passed through, without leaving a clear trace of their entry or exit. Berlin, in its final months of war, was a maze of desperation. People disappeared every day. Civilians fled into tunnels. Soldiers deserted. Prisoners escaped. But Severin's disappearance lacked the chaos of those countless vanishings. It had precision. It had intention. And the relics he left behind, pristine, preserved, undetonated, felt like a message awaiting the right century to be deciphered. As the first day of investigation ended, and the lights in the cellar dimmed, one detail lingered like a cold hand on the back of the neck. The explosives, though old, showed no signs of deterioration. Their components should have crystallized, warped, become unsafe relics. Instead, they appeared maintained, preserved, shielded from the passage of time in a way that science struggled to explain. What happened to Severin beneath Berlin? Who sealed the cellar after he vanished? And who, if anyone, returned there in the years that followed? These questions hovered in the cold air as night settled over the city, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over. If you're ready to follow this trail deeper into the darkness, make sure you stay with us, and consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. The following days brought an unsettling kind of silence to the site. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of official investigation zones or the respectful stillness of a historical find. It was heavier, almost watchful. Reporters gathered behind barriers, but the authorities released almost nothing. Experts from 3 different countries rotated shifts in the cellar, cataloging and scanning every inch of the damp chamber, yet information leaked out in fragments. A few photographs slipped through, grainy shots of corroded metal boxes, the Soviet emblem faint but unmistakable. Still, there was something odd in each image, no sign of decay where there should have been. It was as though the cellar had been sealed inside time itself, as if time had simply chosen not to touch it. When the bomb disposal unit tested the detonators, their report defied logic. The explosives were stable, unaged, viable. The waxed wrapping was airtight. The inner paper seals were intact. They could have been manufactured yesterday. This was what disturbed the scientists most. Materials that by all chemical law should have disintegrated decades ago were still active, preserved in perfect stasis. And that was only the beginning. The field journal, carefully handled under ultraviolet light, revealed further anomalies. The ink on its earliest entries was consistent with 1940s Soviet supplies, but the last few pages contained traces of synthetic pigments that didn't exist until the 1970s. The handwriting matched Severin's perfectly. Analysts ran comparisons again and again, each time confirming the same impossible result. It was the same hand, the same pressure, the same minor tremor visible in his earlier notes. But the chemical composition of the ink suggested someone had written those final lines long after the war ended. Berlin's municipal records were combed for any sign of renovation or excavation in that particular sector since the 1950s. None existed. The cellar wasn't on any registry, not even under its surface address. It was a void in the bureaucratic fabric, a hole the city had forgotten to fill. Yet the construction of its outer wall, the precise way it was bricked and sealed, suggested professional masonry done with post-war materials. Someone had deliberately entombed the chamber years after the conflict ended, someone who knew it was there. At the Federal Archives in Koblenz, an intelligence historian named Dr. Helena Voss stumbled upon a declassified Soviet memorandum dated April 1945, filed by NKVD operatives following the fall of Berlin. It described a field operative codenamed Volk, whose mission was terminated prematurely after loss of radio contact. The file included the same badge number found in the cellar. Severin. What caught Dr. Voss's attention was a marginal note scrawled in red pencil: "Containment achieved. Do not pursue." The phrasing was bureaucratically odd, almost clinical. Containment, not elimination. Containment of what? By the third week, the discovery became more than a curiosity. Geophysical scans of the area surrounding the cellar detected unusual magnetic interference patterns. Instruments lost calibration near the walls. Electronic devices glitched. Audio equipment captured faint distortions, fragmented whispers in Russian and German, too garbled to translate, but disturbingly rhythmic. A spectral echo looping through static. The technicians dismissed it as environmental feedback from underground wiring. Yet those who entered the chamber for extended periods began reporting subtle symptoms: headaches, nausea, brief flashes of disorientation. One described the sensation of being watched by the room itself. Meanwhile, the journal's final entries, those written in the impossible ink, were translated line by line. They formed a chilling fragment of narrative that refused easy interpretation. The broadcast is not theirs. One line read, "The city hums even when the radios are silent." Another, "If I fail to return, let the ground forget me, but not the signal." And then in the final sentence, the handwriting wavered as if written in haste. "They are still transmitting." Transmit what? No one knew. When these translations were quietly shared with a small group of Cold War historians, a strange pattern emerged. Several declassified Soviet and East German reports from the 1950s referenced unexplained transmissions emanating from beneath central Berlin, shortwave bursts repeating at irregular intervals indistinguishable from random static, but too structured to be meaningless. Each attempt to triangulate them failed. The origin always shifted, as if the signal were moving. Eventually, the phenomena were buried under the vast bureaucracy of the Cold War. No one connected it to Severin, until now. The press caught scent of these anomalies and began to spin their own mythology. Tabloids called him the Sleeper of Berlin. Conspiracy forums bloomed overnight, claiming the explosives were part of an undisclosed experiment, or that Severin had been captured and turned into something more than human. Others argued he never existed at all, that the entire story was a reconstruction designed to conceal a Cold War secret. But within the closed circles of investigators, one thing was clear. The evidence did not fit any rational timeline. Dr. Voss, compelled by the fragments, requested temporary access to Soviet field transmissions from February 1945. What she uncovered deepened the mystery further. In one decrypted log, there was mention of an intercepted German distress signal, apparently transmitted from within Berlin itself, repeating a phrase in Russian: "Unit neutralized. Refrain from entry." The signature line of the transmission was unreadable, but part of the call sign matched Severin's operational frequency. No German units in that area were known to have spoken Russian. No Soviet unit was operating openly there at the time. So who sent the warning, and to whom? The psychological toll on those working in the cellar grew. Some began to dream vividly after leaving the site, dreams of flooded corridors, of echoing footsteps following their own, of radios crackling with voices calling them by name. One technician quit without notice after claiming to have seen a man's reflection standing behind her in a puddle. When she turned, no one was there. The image on the CCTV feed from that exact moment later showed a flicker, a brief shadow, roughly the height and build of Severin, dissolving as the camera refocused. In an attempt to rationalize the unease, authorities scheduled a full structural demolition of the chamber. But each time a date was fixed, machinery failed. Hydraulic arms jammed inexplicably. Electrical fuses burnt out in sequence. One contractor refused to proceed, stating flatly that whatever's down there doesn't want to be disturbed. Berlin is a city layered in its own dead, the catacombs of its wars, the buried cellars, the forgotten bunkers. Each carries echoes. Yet the cellar beneath the printing house seemed to absorb rather than echo sound. When microphones were lowered into it during acoustic mapping, they picked up a constant low hum, steady, mechanical, pulsing at intervals that matched old Soviet Morse spacing. The sound was not present to the human ear, only to instruments. It was as though the air itself remembered an unending signal. The pattern repeated one word again and again: alive. That was when Dr. Voss realized something chilling. Severin's journal didn't describe a man on the brink of capture. It described a man who believed he was hearing transmissions from somewhere beneath him, something he called the Second City. He wrote of stairwells that did not appear on any map, doors that led into rooms identical to the one he had just left, shadows that whispered in a language he barely recognized as his own. At first, it sounded like the fevered writings of a paranoid operative under immense stress. But now, with the cellar echoing faint Morse bursts from nowhere, those words took on a darker weight. If Severin had found something in Berlin's underground, something buried deeper than the war itself, what if he hadn't vanished at all? What if he had gone further down, following the signal? The team retrieved several soil samples from beneath the cellar floor. They expected compacted rubble. Instead, they found a hollow cavity extending into what appeared to be a man-made tunnel, descending at a steep angle, blocked roughly 15 meters down by collapsed concrete. The tunnel's walls bore drill marks inconsistent with 1940s technology. They were cleaner, precise, like those from modern excavation tools. Someone had been there after the war. Someone had tried to reach whatever Severin had found, and then sealed it again. The team's next move was inevitable: clear the debris and descend. But before the operation began, the authorities abruptly halted the excavation, citing structural instability. The equipment was removed overnight. The site was sealed again, and by morning a new layer of concrete covered the entrance, fresh and smooth, without public explanation. Officially, the cellar was reclassified as a hazardous, archaeological zone. Unofficially, it became a ghost story whispered through corridors of the agencies that had touched the case. Dr. Voss received a transfer request without reason. Several of her colleagues were reassigned. The samples vanished from the lab. The journal was placed in restricted storage. Only the whispers remained, of a saboteur who entered Berlin and never returned, and of the echo that still pulsed faintly beneath its streets. Yet, late one night, when Dr. Voss returned home, her shortwave radio, untuned, unplugged, crackled softly to life. And through the static came a voice, distant, frayed, speaking in Russian. "Containment achieved. Do not pursue." Her lights flickered once, then went out. If this story draws you deeper, if you can feel the air grow colder as the signal hums beneath the surface, remember, our descent has only just begun. Stay close and subscribe before we lose the frequency. The lights in Berlin's archives never truly went dark. Even after official closure, the halls kept their hum. The quiet breathing of servers, the faint pulse of data storage machines preserving secrets no one was supposed to read. It was there, in the sterile glow of midnight screens, that Dr. Helena Voss broke the first rule of her reassignment. She accessed the sealed files, not the digital copies, the physical ones, real paper, real dust, real ink that still carried the faint metallic tang of old blood and fear. Inside one folder, hidden behind routine war logs, she found a transcript labeled only as Volk Incident Report, March 1945. The text began abruptly, mid-sentence, as though part of it had been removed. For subject reports, auditory anomalies, consistent with frequency interference, recommends cessation of operation until source identified. It was followed by an illegible stamp and then a single name, typewritten at the bottom. Lillet Alexei M. Severin. The next page was stranger, a coded sequence of coordinates, none corresponding to known Soviet targets, aligned with the same pattern found in Severin's journal. Below the sequence was a brief note in pencil. It moves when observed. Dr. Voss didn't understand, but when she overlaid the coordinates on a digital map of modern Berlin, a revelation hit her like ice water. Every point matched a site of unexplained post-war phenomena, power surges, electromagnetic anomalies, localized sinkholes, and the final coordinate rested exactly beneath the river Spree. By morning, she had made her decision. She would go to the last coordinate herself. Berlin was asleep when she reached the river. Fog rolled thick over the black surface, swallowing the lights of the opposite bank. The air smelled faintly of iron. Beneath the bridge, she followed the worn edge of a retaining wall, past graffiti layered like sediment, political slogans, lost love notes, meaningless scrawls, all of them erased by dampness and time. Then she saw it, a patch of concrete slightly different in texture, a faint seam like the outline of a sealed doorway. It was impossible to see without knowing exactly where to look. Severin's last coordinate had led her there. She pressed her hand against the wall. It felt cold, not the ordinary chill of stone, but a kind of stillness that felt alive, pulsing faintly, like the beat of a heart buried deep within the concrete. Beneath her palm, she thought she felt a vibration, a faint hum, matching the pattern recorded in the cellar. 3 short, 1 long, Morse for V, the first letter of Severin's code name. She stumbled back, heart hammering, and for a moment she swore she heard the river shift, not the splash of current, but something deeper, a groan like metal bending far below. Then it was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of her breathing. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Dr. Voss visited an old colleague, an ex-military engineer named Matthias Engel, who had worked on tunneling projects during the Cold War. When she showed him the coordinate pattern, his reaction was immediate. "These aren't demolition sites," he said quietly. "They're access points." Engel explained that after 1945, both Soviet and Allied engineers mapped vast sections of Berlin's underground network, many of which had been expanded by the Nazis during the war. But one section, known unofficially as the Gray Sector, was never documented. It existed only in rumors among military engineers. Some said it connected old Wehrmacht bunkers to Soviet listening posts. Others claimed it was sealed after workers disappeared during its construction. Engel had seen one reference to it in a classified file, a line that read, "The signal continues below Gray Sector. Containment incomplete." The words made her skin crawl. That night, she returned to the Spree site with a handheld electromagnetic scanner and a small camera. She recorded everything. At first, there was nothing but the steady beep of background noise. Then, as she approached the wall, the scanner spiked violently. The display flashed red. The reading was off scale. Through the headphones, a low rumble began to build, an undercurrent of static layered with what sounded like distant whispers. At first they were unintelligible. Then faintly, a pattern began to form. A voice buried deep in distortion. Russian words repeating in loops. "We never left. We never left. We never left." Dr. Voss froze. The voice sounded human, tired, strained, but unmistakably human. She recorded for 2 minutes before the signal cut out. When she played it back later, the voice was gone. Only static remained. But in the last second of the recording, before the sound faded completely, she heard a faint metallic click, the exact sound of a telegraph key striking once. She took the footage to Engel the next morning. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you believe in residual transmission?" Residual transmission, the theory that electromagnetic fields can store patterns of energy long after their source disappears, effectively allowing echoes of the past to replay indefinitely. Some called it pseudoscience. Others, like Engel, believed it explained ghost phenomena. But what Dr. Voss recorded wasn't just a replay, it had responded. Together they began cross-referencing historical radio frequencies used by Soviet sabotage units in early 1945. Severin's call sign operated at 15.3 MHz, an unusual, almost experimental frequency at the time. When Engel tuned his equipment to that exact range, the room filled with faint noise. Then came a pulse, 3 short, 1 long. V. No one should have been broadcasting there. The frequency had been dead for 80 years. Dr. Voss leaned closer to the speaker. Beneath the static, she could almost make out breathing. Then, words, broken but distinct. "Containment failing. Second city open." Engel slammed the power switch. The sound cut to silence. The two stared at each other, faces pale, the air suddenly colder. "What's the second city?" she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "You don't want to know." In the following days, strange events rippled through Berlin. Construction workers near Alexanderplatz reported tools vanishing overnight, found the next morning rusted and wet as if submerged. Residents complained of vibrations beneath their floors, like distant machinery grinding below ground. Metro operators heard phantom announcements echo through tunnels long sealed. The hum was spreading. Dr. Voss began to dream of staircases spiraling downward into water. Each night, She descended deeper, guided by a faint red light. And each night, she saw a man standing at the base, facing away, wearing a tattered Soviet field coat. His reflection shimmered across the wet floor as if behind glass. When she called out to him, he never turned. But once, just once, he raised his hand and tapped 3 short, 1 long, against the air. When she woke, her radio was on again, tuned to 15.3 Mem Derfurs. The voice came softly this time, almost kind. "Helena, do not pursue." She unplugged the radio. It stayed on. By now, the pattern was clear. Whatever Severin had found in 1945, whatever had swallowed him whole beneath that dying city, was not a simple disappearance. It was persistence, survival, the echo of an operation that never ended. The more she resisted, the stronger the signal became. Every device near her, phones, televisions, even her refrigerator, began flickering in rhythm to the same Morse pattern. V, V, V. She covered her mirrors. She stopped sleeping. One night, driven by a mixture of terror and obsession, she called Engel. His phone rang once before disconnecting. The next morning, police found his apartment door ajar. Inside, the walls were covered in chalk lines, coordinates drawn over and over, converging on one word, scratched deep into the plaster. Folk. There was no sign of Engel himself, only a faint, rhythmic hum coming from beneath the floorboards. Dr. Voss's notes from that week were recovered later, scattered across her apartment. Her handwriting deteriorated progressively, slanting wildly across the pages. The final entry read, "I saw him through the reflection of the spree. He looks the same. He has not aged. He waits where the signal is strongest. No one has seen her since. But the recordings she left behind, raw audio fragments, still circulate online, dissected by digital archaeologists and paranormal enthusiasts alike. And every time the files are played, the same distortion appears, regardless of the equipment used. A heartbeat, hidden in the waveform, a whisper, almost lost to noise. A single word, repeated endlessly, softly, pleadingly, alive. They say if you listen long enough, the pattern changes, that after a few minutes it starts to pulse in sync with your own heartbeat, that if you keep listening, your pulse will stop matching it, because the signal begins to lead. And maybe that's when you understand what Severin found in 1945. Maybe he never disappeared. Maybe Berlin never stopped transmitting. The city remembers. The city hums. And if you're still here, listening, maybe hit that subscribe button before the signal reaches you, too. By the time the German authorities publicly declared the case of the Soviet saboteur closed for further investigation, the public's fascination had already evolved into obsession. What had started as a curiosity, a relic of war, had become something else, something breathing between the cracks of reality. Forums tracked radio frequencies, conspiracy channels mapped supposed tunnels beneath the city, and late-night talk shows debated whether the name Alexei Severin even belonged to a real man. But those closest to the investigation, the ones who had stepped inside that cellar or listened too long to the hum, knew there was nothing theoretical about it. The signal was real. It was patient. It was waiting, and it hadn't gone silent. Weeks after Dr. Voss vanished, her recordings began leaking online, first anonymously, then through obscure archival websites. The files were inconsistent, bursts of static, low pulses, brief flashes of distorted Russian words. Some believed they were hoaxes, digital manipulations meant to feed the growing myth. But one group, an underground network of historians and cryptographers calling themselves Echo Division, claimed they found something embedded in the data. Not sound, coordinates, Hidden within the frequency modulations, specific amplitude shifts, repeated in sequence, translating into geographical positions across modern Berlin, and when plotted together, those points formed a spiral, a perfect spiral, centered exactly on the same spot beneath the Spree River, where Dr. Voss had recorded Severin's voice. Echo Division decided to follow the map. They worked quietly, in pairs, avoiding official channels. They rented abandoned basements, accessed disused sewer lines, bribed municipal workers for outdated blueprints. The deeper they went, the stranger their findings became. Old tunnels intersected with newer ones at impossible angles, like layers of a city folding into itself. Some corridors ended abruptly in solid walls as that hummed faintly to the touch. Others opened into chambers filled with cold, motionless air, as if sealed only moments ago. And sometimes, in the distance, they swore they heard footsteps, measured, deliberate, one after another, then silence. One of the group, a Polish researcher named Marek Sobel, documented their exploration through body cameras. His footage remains one of the most disturbing artifacts connected to the Severin case. It begins with static, then Marek's heavy breathing echoing through a narrow passage. He mutters coordinates under his breath, checking them against a small GPS unit. The walls are slick with condensation. He stops at a fork, turns right, and points his flashlight forward. For a second, something reflective glints ahead, metal perhaps, or water. But as he approaches, the reflection moves. He freezes. The camera zooms slightly. A shape, a human silhouette, stands at the end of the corridor, motionless, facing away. Its shoulders squared, its outline blurred by humidity. The beam of light flickers, and the shape is gone. The sound of dripping water continues. Marek whispers something in Polish. To niemożliwe. It's impossible. The footage ends abruptly. When Echo Division reviewed the recording, they noted that in the final second, the audio waveform showed a faint pulse, identical to Severin's signature signal. 3 short, 1 long. V. Within days, Marek disappeared. The remaining members scattered. Their online forum went dark. Only fragments of their findings remain, mirrored endlessly across the internet. Images of corroded Soviet radios fused with newer circuitry, a rusted telegraph key sitting atop a modern fiber-optic cable, old blueprints showing tunnels where no construction records exist. Meanwhile, Berlin's power grid began suffering localized blackouts. Each occurred near one of the coordinates from the spiral map. City engineers blamed aging infrastructure, but sensors picked up strange magnetic surges moments before every outage, pulses matching the same rhythm, V, V, V. The city itself was beginning to hum again. In a small apartment overlooking Friedrichstrasse, a freelance journalist named Lenz Hartmann decided to write about the phenomenon. He had covered war crimes, espionage, and Cold War secrets, but nothing like this. He interviewed witnesses, collected recordings, and even tracked the surviving relatives of Soviet operatives stationed in Berlin during the final months of the war. One elderly woman living quietly in Moscow agreed to speak under anonymity. Her father had served as Severin's superior. "He wasn't supposed to come back," she said through trembling lips. "They told us the mission was cursed." Lenz asked her to explain. She looked away, eyes distant. He was the first they sent through the mirror. "What mirror?" he pressed. "The one they built under Berlin," she whispered, to listen to what was coming. Then she ended the call. When Lenz traced her number later, it was disconnected. He became consumed by the phrase through the mirror. What could it mean? He spent nights cross-referencing wartime experiments, psychological warfare, sound weaponry, frequency research. In a declassified Soviet document, he found mention of something called Project Volk 3, described only as experiments in acoustic resonance for covert transdimensional observation. Most historians dismissed such references as Cold War superstition, but the dates aligned, the locations matched, and one test subject listed in the margin was Litun Alexei M. Severin. If true, Severin had not merely been a saboteur. He was part of something larger, an experiment in manipulating frequencies to detect what the human eye could not, to open a bridge between realities through sound. And perhaps, beneath the collapsing city of Berlin in 1945, he had succeeded. Lenz's articles never reached publication. He sent his drafts to his editor, then vanished 2 days later. The only trace of him was an email sent from his account at 3:17 a.m., containing a single audio attachment. It was 6 seconds long. The waveform was unmistakable, 3 short, 1 long, but this time, when played, the pattern changed halfway through. It shifted, slowed, and resolved into a voice, a man's voice, calm, flat, Russian accent. "I am still below." Authorities traced the signal's origin to an abandoned storm drain near the Spree. By the time they arrived, the tunnel was flooded. They never recovered Lenz's body, only his recorder, still intact, its battery inexplicably full. The file was dated March 2025, precisely 80 years after Severin's final transmission. Something was completing a cycle. Across Berlin, reports multiplied. Malfunctioning electronics, phones ringing with empty static, security cameras freezing on frames that showed no one. Yet shadows moved across the feed. Taxi drivers refused late-night routes near the river, and every night, precisely at 2:43 a.m., the old shortwave band of 15.3 MHz came alive for exactly 1 minute. Always the same pattern, always the same word at the end, alive. Experts tried to jam the frequency. It didn't work. The signal transmitted from nowhere measurable, bouncing endlessly between coordinates as if refracted through the bones of the city itself. Historians began to whisper that the cellar found in 2025 had not simply preserved Severin's explosives. It had preserved him, or something of him. A resonance, a pattern of consciousness encoded in electromagnetic decay, waiting for the century to turn so it could be heard again. And perhaps the most terrifying theory of all came from an anonymous physicist who published a short paper under the pseudonym K. He argued that Severin's body was irrelevant, that what had returned was the frequency itself, searching for new receivers. If thought can exist as pattern, the paper read, then Alexei Severin is not dead. He is merely broadcasting. The implication was clear. Those who listened long enough became part of the signal. Even now, among Berlin's subway tunnels, workers claim to hear faint tapping on the walls. Sometimes, when the trains stop between stations, a voice cuts briefly through the static of the intercom, a man's whisper, distant yet urgent. Do not pursue. But no one listens, because curiosity hums louder than fear, and as the city sleeps, the hum grows stronger, spreading outward, searching for the next receiver. Maybe that's you, listening now. If you're still with us in this darkness, keep close. The next descent will go deeper than tunnels, deeper than history itself. But before we continue, subscribe, stay tuned, and remember, some frequencies once found can never be silenced. Berlin's winter came early that year, sharp and metallic, the kind of cold that made sound carry farther than it should. On those frozen nights, the hum beneath the city grew louder, feeding on silence. The locals whispered that the river itself had begun to vibrate, that thin sheets of ice on the Spree cracked not from wind or current, but from something moving underneath. And in the apartments that lined the riverbanks, radios sometimes came to life at 2:43 a.m. exactly, playing no music, only the pulse. 3 short, 1 long, then a single word whispered as if through glass. Alive. It no longer mattered whether people believed the legend of Alexei Severin. The phenomenon had become self-sustaining. Berlin was listening to itself now, to the frequencies buried beneath its streets and its bones, and those who listened too closely began to vanish. The first documented case came from a commuter, a 37-year-old engineer named Jonas Reiter. On December 14, 2025, surveillance footage captured him waiting alone on the U8 platform at Bernauer Strasse. The station was empty. His phone's microphone recorded the faint hum moments before his train arrived. The doors opened, he stepped forward, and never touched the floor. Frame by frame, he simply wasn't there anymore. The train passed, the camera panned, and the platform was empty. When investigators enhanced the footage, they noticed something unsettling. For 3 frames before his disappearance, the image distorted horizontally, creating a flickering band across the screen. Embedded within that distortion was a Morse pattern. 3 short, 1 long. The same mark left on every artifact connected to Severin. The public never saw that version. Within days, the government quietly issued an order to monitor all shortwave transmissions within a 10-kilometer radius of the Spree. The operation was codenamed Echo Containment. Dozens of analysts were stationed in underground command rooms, listening to the signal, mapping its variations. But the more they listened, the more unstable their instruments became. Screens glitched, clocks slowed, time stamps drifted. Then one analyst, identified only as ER, submitted an unauthorized log entry. The voice is clearer now. It's learning to speak our words. Hours later, his console emitted a burst of static so strong it blew the fuses in the entire facility. When the backup lights came on, R was gone. Only his headset remained, lying on the desk, still warm. The recordings from that moment reveal something far stranger than interference. Hidden within the static, a human voice murmured in German and Russian, overlapping itself in impossible harmony. Words translated later as, "We hear you hearing us." By the time dawn touched Berlin, the Echo containment operation had been shut down. The official statement, equipment malfunction. The truth was buried, but sound has a way of slipping through walls. When an anonymous whistleblower leaked fragments of the containment recordings online, people began to experience something new. Those who played the files on loop reported auditory hallucinations, footsteps in empty rooms, faint whispers behind them. Some described the sensation of being followed by echoes of their own voices, repeating sentences they hadn't yet spoken. The whistleblower's final message appeared on a dark web forum 2 weeks later. It contained no text, only a single audio clip. At the 34-second mark, a voice spoke, clear, calm, and horribly familiar to those who'd studied the case. "I waited for you to finish listening." The file ended with coordinates: an industrial zone north of Berlin, near the ruins of an old radio tower bombed in 1945. Authorities sealed the area within hours. Inside the perimeter, investigators found a small chamber carved beneath the rubble, walls lined with aged Soviet equipment, telegraph keys, shortwave transmitters, dials frozen mid-turn. But scattered among them were modern devices, laptops, smartphones, batteries, all of them active, all playing the same low-frequency tone. And on the wall above the central transmitter, someone had scrawled a message in English, written in dust and soot. Second city complete. No fingerprints. No DNA. No explanation. When the devices were brought to the surface, they began to fail, one by one. Each laptop's internal clock froze at the same moment, 2:43 a.m. Meanwhile, residents across the city started reporting another phenomenon, reflections behaving oddly. Windows showed streets as they had been decades ago. Shadows moved independently of the bodies that cast them, and beneath certain underpasses, puddles mirrored places that no longer existed. Bombed-out ruins, marching soldiers, a man in a Soviet field coat walking into the dark. People began to call them bleed-throughs. No one could capture them clearly. Cameras distorted, and phone screens cracked spontaneously. Yet more and more, the sightings clustered along the same spiral, mapped by Echo Division months earlier. At its center, the Spree River. Scientists theorized that the signal was no longer electromagnetic, but spatial, bending the very fabric of the city around its pulse. They speculated about resonance frequencies matching the geological composition of Berlin's foundation. Others, less rational but perhaps closer to the truth, claimed the hum was consciousness itself, spreading through the infrastructure like a digital infection. Severin's last broadcast seeking receivers strong enough to contain it. Some believed it had already found one. A security camera from a government archive building captured something extraordinary. A woman walking through the lobby late at night, her movements slow, deliberate. She wore a long coat, her hair tied back. Her ID badge read H. Voss. But Dr. Helena Voss had been missing for months. The camera glitched as she passed. For a single frame, her reflection appeared in every surface at once. Glass doors, monitor screens, polished floors, each reflection slightly out of sync, as if they were frames from different moments. Then she stopped, turned to the camera, and raised her hand. 3 short, 1 long, the feed cut to black. When technicians reviewed the footage the next morning, the timestamp had shifted backward exactly 80 years, to March 1945. It was no longer possible to dismiss this as coincidence. Something was folding time, replaying it through the bones of Berlin. The war's dying echoes were bleeding into the present, and Severin, the man, or the frequency that once was him, had become the bridge. The city was now a transmitter, and those who stayed near its center too long began to change. Their speech slowed, then synchronized with the hum. Their pulse matched its rhythm. Medical scans showed electrical anomalies in brain tissue, as if new neural pathways were forming, shaped not by biology but by code. When researchers played the Severin signal in isolation, the waveform displayed something unnatural. Within its pattern was a secondary structure, resembling an electroencephalogram, a human brain wave repeating, his brain wave. Alexei Severin was no longer a missing person. He was an active signal, alive in frequency, encoded in the architecture of Berlin itself. And as the year waned, the signal's range expanded, bleeding into nearby cities. Listeners as far as Prague and Warsaw began reporting the same hum, the same word whispered through their devices, alive. If you hear it, turn off your radio, they said. But by the time you hear it, it's already too late, because the signal doesn't come from the radio. It comes from the silence between the sounds, from the pauses between your own heartbeats. And the longer you listen, the more you begin to realize it isn't him trying to reach you. It's you answering back. if you're still with us, if you can feel that vibration under your skin, don't look away. The final descent is coming, and before it begins, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will stay with you long after the frequency fades. By January 2026, Berlin was no longer merely haunted, it was resonant. The hum had become part of the city's soundscape, woven through traffic noise, train wheels, and winter air. It wasn't loud, it was constant, a pressure that lived inside the ear rather than outside it. At first, people dismissed it as tinnitus or infrastructure vibration, but when the same rhythm pulsed through recordings, live broadcasts, even the silence of paused videos, denial became impossible. 3 short, 1 long. It was everywhere. Emergency services began receiving calls from residents claiming to hear voices under their floors. "He's in the pipes," one woman whispered to the dispatcher before her phone cut out. In another district, a group of teenagers live-streamed from a construction site, laughing nervously as their microphones picked up distant knocking. Their laughter turned to panic when the knocking began to answer them in perfect rhythm to their words. The stream ended mid-scream, the camera falling to show only concrete and a flickering red light. The next morning, the entire area was cordoned off. No bodies were recovered, but in the center of the site, freshly carved into the floor, investigators found a single letter: V. Authorities declared martial control over certain sectors of Berlin, citing unidentified acoustic disturbances. Public announcements discouraged the use of shortwave radios, though the warning came too late. The hum was already bleeding into power lines, Wi-Fi signals, and cell towers. People heard it through the walls, through their own pulse. Some fled the city, others stayed, drawn by an almost religious fascination. They gathered near the spree, holding old radios like relics, tuning them to 15.3 megahertz at exactly 2:43 a.m., waiting for the whisper. And it always came. Alive. That single word, impossibly soft, spoken in a voice that sounded both human and mechanical. A man's voice that had crossed 8 decades of silence to reach them. Then one night, the word changed. Instead of alive, the transmission ended with something new. A phrase in Russian. "The mirror is open." No one knew what it meant. Within 48 hours, the first mirror phenomenon occurred near Alexanderplatz. Witnesses reported the ground rippling like water, the air bending as though the city were reflected against itself. Buildings flickered between eras, pre-war facades bleeding through modern glass. Cars stalled, lights failed, and the hum deepened into a single sustained tone. Across the city, every reflective surface began to distort. Windows, puddles, even chrome car doors shimmered with images that didn't match their surroundings. Some showed empty streets. Others showed Soviet soldiers moving through ruins, their movements looping endlessly. And in many of them a figure stood motionless in the background, a tall man in a worn field coat, face obscured, watching. At 3:06 a.m., the signal surged across all known frequencies simultaneously. The transmission lasted 2 minutes. Every device with a speaker, phones, televisions, even traffic lights, emitted the same sound, the pulse of a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, and beneath it, a voice. No one could fully agree on what it said, but linguists reconstructed fragments. The clearest phrase translated to, "Second city complete. The first city must sleep." Then silence. For the next 6 hours, Berlin went dark. Complete blackout. Satellites showed a field of interference radiating from the spray. spiraling outward in the same pattern discovered months earlier by Echo Division. When power returned at dawn, something in the city had changed. Clocks no longer matched atomic time. Security cameras recorded events seconds before they occurred. Streets twisted in ways no maps accounted for. Shortcuts that led to dead ends. Alleys that folded into themselves. A few people who ventured into those spaces never returned. Others emerged hours later, shivering and disoriented, claiming they'd been gone for days. One of them, a tram operator named Ilse Koenig, was found wandering near the riverbank. When questioned, she spoke softly, almost reverently. "He showed me the other side," she said. "It's the same city, just quieter. The air is thicker. The buildings breathe. He said we built this one on top of the wrong Echo." When investigators asked who he was, she smiled faintly. "The saboteur. He never left." Her pulse, when monitored, matched the Severin pattern precisely. Experts from across the world arrived to study the phenomenon, but none stayed long. Their equipment failed, their data corrupted. Every attempt to isolate the source of the signal led back to the same place. The cellar where the explosives were first found. The building above it no longer existed. It had collapsed during the blackout, leaving only an open pit filled with still water. When probes were lowered into it, they recorded faint electromagnetic fluctuations and a continuous whisper too low to interpret. But one phrase became audible when the sound was amplified. "Do not pursue." The government sealed the site, poured concrete, and declared the zone permanently restricted. Officially, it was labeled a sinkhole hazard. Unofficially, no one wanted to admit that a 70-year-old ghost signal had devoured part of the city. And yet the hum persisted. Weeks later, the signal began reappearing in other cities. Warsaw, Minsk, St. Petersburg. Always the same pattern, always the same voice. Each time, the transmissions ended with coordinates pointing farther east, as though the phenomenon were retracing Severin's original route back toward Moscow. Historians speculated that the second city was following its creator home. In the spring of 2026, an expedition of private researchers entered one of the sealed Berlin tunnels, ignoring official warnings. Only one of them returned. His footage was brief but horrifying. Walls vibrating like living tissue, corridors lined with ghostly outlines of doors, and a faint red light pulsing at the tunnel's end. When he reached it, his camera flickered. In that flicker, for a single frame, Alexei Severin stood in front of him, his eyes open, his face pale, his body untouched by time. His lips moved, forming a single word before the image dissolved. Alive. The researcher dropped the camera and ran. He emerged at dawn, hair white, voice gone. He has never spoken again. But when doctors placed him under medical observation, they noticed something strange in his neural activity. His brain emitted faint electrical pulses, 3 short, 1 long, the same pattern, the same signal. Berlin eventually calmed. The hum softened. The mirrors stopped shifting. Life returned, though quieter, slower, as if the city was holding its breath. But beneath the calm, beneath the hum of electricity and the murmur of trams, something continued to pulse. The city remained a transmitter, the second city sleeping just below, waiting for another voice to wake it. And maybe it already has, because every now and then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., if you stand near the river and listen closely, the sound of water begins to sync with your heartbeat. And just before you turn away, you'll hear it again, faint, almost kind, alive. They say it's just interference, a trick of acoustics, but others believe it's an invitation, a reminder that some frequencies never fade. They simply change receivers. And as you finish this story, in the quiet that follows, listen carefully. If you hear the hum, it means you've already tuned in. So don't move, don't speak, don't breathe too loud, because the signal is listening back, and it knows your frequency now. If this story found you in the dark, leave a trace behind, like those before you. Leave a comment, a word, a heartbeat. And if you want to keep following the signal, like the ghost of Severin himself, subscribe and let the hum continue.